Welcome back to the program, Policy Director at Employ America, Elizabeth Pancotti. Elizabeth, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the COVID bill signed yesterday, I should say passed yesterday, signed, I would imagine, imminently. And so obviously you look at this from, a focus on employment. Let's start off with the bad that's in this bill from your perspective, because really in many respects, it is, we're talking about an absence. I mean, I was trying to sort of contrast it to the CARES Act, which the focus of which was less, it seems to me, on actually getting money into the hands of people directly. And in some instances, a bank shot, literally a bank shot, I guess, where it would open up lending facilities for corporations, creating wealth inequality, et cetera, et cetera. This is not like that, but there are things in this bill that would have been much better to have. I think everybody's, or at least many people listening feel that way about the $15 minimum wage. That would have had a structural and long-term implication. But aside from that, which I think, people are quite aware of, what else in this bill that you look at that if you had to add to it, you would have done?
So I think there are a couple of key omissions. One, which was, originally included in the president's plan, was obviously the minimum wage increase to $15 an hour over the next 4 years. That wasn't scrapped because because of lack of support necessarily, but more so of the, arcane Byrd rule in a ruling by the parliamentarian. So that, I think, is the big omission here. And, Democrats have said they'll work to try to pass that outside of the reconciliation process where the Byrd rule doesn't apply. But, not sure really what the prospects are there for that, given, intense opposition from the Republicans and even from, Senator Manchin, et cetera. So that, I think, is the big one. There are a couple others. So one is that there's no hazard pay included in this package. And in the president's plan, he said, we call on corporations to step up and make sure that workers are compensated if they're having to report to work in still unsafe conditions, and obviously those who have reported to work for the last year as the virus has raged. So that's one that was included in the HEROES Act, which Democrats proposed last May, which is about a $3 trillion package that never really went anywhere outside of the House. So that's one. Paid leave is another one that I think folks are really hoping for a stronger policy on. It's left as an optional tax credit. And so if employers offer paid leave, they'll be kind of reimbursed for that through the tax system. But it's not mandatory as it was kind of early in the virus. So that is one. That, I think, was less of a policy decision and more of a what could we do under the Byrd rule too.
All right, just and to be clear on that, the paid leave is basically paying for people to not come into work because the work would put them at risk in some fashion.
I think it's like, if you get COVID, right? It's like paid sick and family leave. So if you get COVID, if your spouse gets COVID, if your child gets COVID, you technically aren't paid for the time you have to take off for that. Or if you get sick for any other reason, it's more of a short-term paid leave thing. So it would, it provides 2 or 3 weeks of paid leave, which is really intended as sick leave. But we are, a country that does not have a national paid family sick leave policy. So not beefing that up in the middle of a public health crisis does seem like an omission. I think it really was a Byrd rule choice and not, I think the Biden administration has been supportive of national paid leave.
Okay, and a Byrd rule, specifically what you're talking about there, it had to come in under $1.9 trillion because why?
Yeah.
No.
So this is that. So the Byrd rule is this thing that says, budget impacts have to be a certain threshold. They have to be germane. It's like, you have to be, it can't be an incidental change. It's a very silly thing that has to go along with the reconciliation process. So it's not so much about how it scores and being under. In fact, the paid leave program actually is only $3 to $5 billion. It's not that expensive, but it has more to do with what you can do in a reconciliation package, given that reconciliation bills are held to different rules than other Senate bills.
So it does provide funding for it. It just doesn't make it mandatory.
Yes, it's an employer tax credit rather than telling employers you have to offer paid leave.
Okay, fair enough. And the the next thing that you think it's sort of lacking?
Yeah. So I think the big one here, which last time I was on the show, I think we talked about this too, and this has been true of all of the bills, and that there are no, these things are tied to either arbitrary end dates, or they're one-time payments, or they're for a year or two. There's no kind of open-endedness tied to triggers or economic indicators to say, we will keep this program or these programs, or we will beef up these programs tied to the unemployment rate or tied to public health indicators. So unemployment insurance, for example, those programs expire on September 6th, which happens to be Labor Day. And that was like an arbitrary date decided to keep under, maybe a certain cost, but really more, I think, was just as a result of Joe Manchin's, temper tantrum on the floor for 10 hours. But there, I think, we didn't say unemployment benefits will be in place until the unemployment rate is very low or until the labor market rebounds. We said unemployment benefits will be, in place until this random date we picked out of a hat that got Joe Manchin's vote. Like there was no, research-backed reason for this. And I think, most economists would tell you, we expect to have to go back for additional unemployment insurance extensions, and the labor market probably won't be what it was in February in September. So there, I think, checks were also in that same regard, where some folks have proposed tying checks to automatic stabilizers so that they're sent out automatically when we hit different economic indicators. And the checks, as you know, are just a one-time $1,400 to make the $600, $2,000 total. But we didn't say, if coronavirus cases increase by X, or if, Y number of people are laid off in the next 5 months, we'll send another round of checks. It was just a one-time thing, and we have to go back to the pot if we want additional checks.
And to be clear on the unemployment insurance, we're talking about the expansion of benefits, the sort of federal augmentation of state benefits. Does it also expand it in terms of weeks that you can be on unemployment?
Yeah, so let's talk through the UI provision. So there's 4 key things that the bill does. The one is that the $300 top off that is added to state unemployment checks or any unemployment benefits, which are around $300 themselves, it makes them around $600 for the average claimant. So everybody gets $300 added to their check amount. This is similar to what we had at the beginning of the pandemic, which was $600, but it's been cut. President Biden and Democrats had proposed increasing that for the next 6 months to $400 per week. That was, included in the House version of the bill, but was scrapped in the Senate due to opposition from Senator Manchin. So that's the one thing. Then the next program is the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, PUA, and that program is for gig workers, self-employed workers, misclassified or correctly classified, as well as, some other folks who are eligible. So people who, need to quit their job because their children's schools are closed and they have to stay home with the kids. If you get coronavirus and you tell your employer I have to take 2 weeks off and they fire you because you're not there, all those sorts of things fit into that category. So about half of people are on these federal extension and expansion programs. The extension program is PEUC, and that adds additional weeks to unemployment insurance. And this bill adds up to 29 additional weeks on top of the 24 that was already available from the last 2 bills. So for everybody, for the vast majority of claimants, unemployed workers are going to be eligible for up to 75 weeks of benefits. And comparing that to the Great Recession, we had 13 separate extensions leading to a total of 99 weeks. And so we've only had 3 extensions this time and got to 75. So I think we are really, I think the president and Democrats really do see the urgency and the necessity of extending benefits for unemployed workers. And so we're at a total of 75 now.
And how does that 75, it's going to, presumably, right? If someone lost their job a year ago when this started, they will be at least eligible for for the increased unemployment for, I guess, presumably 20 weeks after September,
No, so these programs cut off entirely at September 6th. So if you've only claimed, so if you're on PUA, that gig worker program, and you get laid off in the beginning of August, you're only going to get the 6 weeks. You don't get, there's a hard cliff is what we call it. So you can get up to. So this covers everybody. If you were laid off on March 2nd or later, you'll be covered for the entirety. So as long as your layoff was after, the 1st of March, you'll be covered up until September 6th. You won't exhaust your benefits.
And what is the status of state unemployment coffers, right? Because last we spoke, I think, we talked about how they were so ravaged, even still not refilled after the Great Recession. And there's a great amount of disparity in states in terms of the unemployment benefits they're able to provide.
Yeah. So, I mean, the average benefit really does vary. So, for example, in Mississippi and Louisiana, where there's a high share of Black workers, the average weekly benefit is about $190. And conversely, in states like Massachusetts, it could be, $800, $900. So there's a lot of geographic variation, and we know that leads to a lot of racial disparities in the unemployment benefits. So so in Louisiana, the average worker will get $190 in state benefits and $300 in the $300 top off. And in Massachusetts, they might get, $800 in state benefits plus the $300 in the federal benefit. We know that, the cost of living in the vast majority of Massachusetts is higher than Louisiana, but the gap's not, that large. In terms of what states are doing now, we saw this in the aftermath of the Great Recession, where they have spent so much money on unemployment benefits, and they are so in debt to the federal government to pay out those benefits that they are actually now, as state legislatures come into session this spring, they are looking to cut unemployment benefits. And so there's right now a plan in Ohio to business side reform for the unemployment insurance system that says, Ohio offers too many weeks and they offer benefits that are too generous, and they should look like Florida, which, has a great system. And the problem with the Florida system is that it's by and large considered the worst in the country, and only offers 12 weeks of unemployment insurance to workers. The Ohio plan also proposes cutting. So 12 states offer what's called dependent allowances. So they give you a little bit more if you have children and you're unemployed. And the pro-business reforms in Ohio propose cutting the dependent allowance. So cutting money for kids, really great policy there.
September 6th, that date is, isn't that date in and of itself problematic? I mean, I can't, off the top of my head, I have not checked the schedule, but it seems to me, Senate is usually out of session.
So two things. So it's Labor Day. We're going to cut support for workers on the day for workers, which seems like a bad one. But yes, the Senate is still out of session. So that was the problem. The House had passed a version ending those benefits on August 29th. And we said, hey, you can't end the benefits on August 29th. Congress is going to be out. That's a really, that's a recipe for disaster. And so Democrats, Senator Wyden and Senator Carper had proposed extending to October 3rd. We thought we had all the votes for that at the last minute. Joe Manchin opposed it. And we only got one additional week to bring us to September 6th. But Congress is still on recess. The Senate is still on recess that day. So we are still we have to address this cliff before Congress leaves in the beginning of August. So we're really looking at, a crisis in July to be able to solve this early.
Wow, that's not good, because the idea that, look at, they're gonna pass this literally days before I think March 14th was
Sunday.
Was a drop dead day for a lot of unemployment insurance and the extensions. And so this is, they tend to wait to the last second, I guess is the point.
We said, this is a consequence. So running up to the cliff on Sunday was a consequence of Republicans. So we had secured 16 weeks in the December package for unemployment insurance. And so we knew that we were going to do this through reconciliation. We knew reconciliation takes forever. There's a lot of different process that goes in the background. Like, no one's dragging their feet right now. Everyone's working as hard as possible to get this over the finish line, but we knew it would take time. We tried to get 16 weeks and Republicans scaled it back to 11. So that was a consequence of having that $900 cap on the December bill. The folks to blame for running up to the clock on this one are certainly the Republicans that negotiated that deal in December.
One more element that came out of that Joe Manchin temper tantrum, which actually, I guess, added to one, according to the reporting, he was pretty upset about this, ostensibly, was that they dropped it from 400 to 300. They scaled back by 4 weeks or so from October 3rd to September 6th. And the difference, though, is that the first $10,200 of unemployment insurance is not taxable. Will you explain how that works and how much of a savings is that going to be for people on unemployment?
Yeah, so this is an incredible get. I had been advocating for tax forgiveness since last July, and we were told it was, dead on arrival. This was never going to happen. And then as tax season opened, every unemployed worker logged into TurboTax, and they saw they owed the IRS $1,000 or $2,000 because of the generosity of UI benefits last year. So unemployment benefits. First off, let's back up. They weren't always taxed. This was a result of kind of Reagan era economics, where some conservative economists in the 70s and 80s said, we have to tax these benefits now to make sure people aren't disincentivized from going back to work, which we've heard that argument a lot this year and no research to support it. From 1935 to 1980, these benefits weren't taxed. And then in the 80s, we started taxing them. So this year, everybody was surprised to learn that they owed $1,000 or $2,000 in federal and state and sometimes, New York City owed local taxes. So progressives, Bernie Sanders, really fought for tax forgiveness. They said, if you're gonna screw workers out of this $100, which we knew we didn't have Joe Manchin's support for, we knew we had to cut it to $300. We didn't know that we had to cut the weeks. We thought we had support there, but they said you have to give them something, and so. The benefit for folks in low income brackets is about $1,020 up to, if you earned over $10,000 in unemployment benefits, which the average person earned about $14,500 last year. So for most people, this is about $1,000 directly in their pockets, either in reducing their tax bill or increasing their refund. And for, folks in the 12% bracket, it could be a little bit more, but we're looking at, about $1,000, $1,500 at most. That's really incredible, because what we had heard from workers is that they were going to file their taxes, and as soon as they got their stimulus check, pay the IRS their stimulus. If you got a $1,400 tax bill and you get a $1,400 check from the IRS, they were literally just going to return it to sender. And that, is not the point of stimulus checks, for the IRS to write itself a check. And so, this was really impactful relief for jobless workers. And it's funny that Joe Manchin was so opposed to this, because he had said for months, we need more targeted aid, we can't give checks to everybody who wasn't impacted. And these people, if you got unemployment insurance last year, you were clearly impacted, you lost your job. And so providing direct tax relief to these people seems like some of the most targeted aid you can get. And he was opposed to it. Eventually, they introduced $150,000 household income cap on that tax forgiveness. So if your family makes $150,000, including the rest of your UI, you won't be eligible for this. But we expect that to be a handful of people. I mean, this isn't, the number of people in America who make $150,000 is very small, and the number of people who lost their jobs in high wage jobs is even lower. So we don't expect for that. That was kind of a meaningless introduction, but it made him feel better, and we got it over the finish line. It is,
this guy, Joe Manchin, it's just like he's like I don't know. He just reminds me as like a guy who's like in one of those like dinner theater murder mysteries. And it's not even like sort of, he's not even doing the work as an actor. He's just sort of like, put glasses on me. I'm a guy,
if he wants something to kind of distinguish himself, just get a monocle or something.
Well, no, he threw this big fit, and then his statement says that it's $10,000 in tax relief for jobless workers. So I'm not sure that he even understands the proposal. It's $1,000. It's a $1,000 tax break. It just is on $10,000. But this forgiveness is actually incredible, because it reduces what's called your adjusted gross income, which is like the big number that comes out of your tax return that affects all sorts of other programs like Pell Grants for higher education. It affects your ACA subsidies, your healthcare subsidies for a year or two. I mean, this is going to have kind of, it's not just that you get $1,000 check up front. It reduces a whole bunch of stuff, or makes you eligible for a whole bunch of other government aid after.
There's a lot of knock-on of impacts of this.
Yeah.
So
it's a really good domino effect for once.
That's fantastic. All right, so let's talk about, and I guess we've already sort of slipped into the good of the bill, but give me a sense. I mean, I've heard numbers: 45% reduction in child poverty. This, I presume, comes from the tax credits, or the refundable tax credits. Will you walk us through that, and also tell me why they need to call this refundable tax credits as opposed to like child allowance, like
Child
refundable
poverty
tax credits
payments,
seems
yeah.
to be, if you set out, we want to make sure that people don't fully understand that we're providing material support. So we're going to name it something that is almost impossible to really fully.
Yeah. It's like economic impact payments. We can't, they're not stimulus checks. Yes.
Right. Economic impact payments almost sound more direct than
A little bit.
refundable tax credit. It's
the most democratic name that they could have called.
So I will say that it works from it beefs up an existing program, which is a refundable tax credit, but it does really change the way that we think and the way that people receive those benefits. So the American Rescue Plan, as you said, will cut child poverty in half, which, like, let's stop right there and say, if we think about, the Trump tax cuts and the CARES Act and all those other things, we've never been able to really say this about legislation offered, in modern history, but definitely not in the Trump administration. So for the Biden administration to come out and say, our number one priority, we have one shot to do something, and we're going to focus on cutting child poverty. Like, that is, I think, a really good thing to be able to say about this administration from, day 50, today's day 50. That said, the way that the tax credit works is that what normally happens is you have a kid the whole year, you pay a lot of money for their childcare, for their diapers, for their food. And at the end of the year in April, when you file your taxes, you get about $2,000 back for that kid. And the refundability of it is a whole nother thing, but it doesn't really matter. In most cases, you just get $2,000 for the kid. Now what's going to happen is throughout the year, you will get up to $300 per month for that kid. And so it increases the amount for $3,000 for children over 6 and $3,600 for children under 6. So it increases the amount by either $1,000 or $1,600 for most families. And it's going to be paid out over the course of the year. It's not like when you're raising a kid, you don't spend all the money in April and we're like, okay, well, I spent all the money on the kid and that's it. You spend it throughout the year. So this is going to give parents up to $300 a month, or $360 a month for kids. And the IRS plans to pay that out. This is another weird thing. Technically, the law says periodically, because that's what we had to do to get the law passed. The Biden administration plans to pay that out monthly, starting in July.
And is there a cap on this? Is every single family with children going to receive this payment?
There's a cap on it, yeah. So $150,000, I think, is the cap.
Okay. And now, how was Mitt Romney's proposal different from this? Because he had countered with a proposal that really had more to do with how it was paid out by the Social Security Administration.
Yeah, the benefits aren't there's some differences in the benefits, but this payment is handled through, I guess there's no real optimal agency to write these checks in the federal government. And that's because we have very weird agencies that don't typically write checks to Americans. So the IRS issues, in most cases, they write a check to most families once a year. When you file your tax return and you get a refund check, right? They are used to that process. And they have information on how many kids you have, how much money you made, where your mailing address is, your direct deposit information, right? They've got all that information, but they're only used to doing it once a year. The Romney plan instead says, okay, well, the Social Security Administration cuts checks to millions of Americans every month. If we're going to cut checks to millions of Americans every month, let's put it in the agency that cuts checks every month. The problem with the Social Security, or like the drawbacks between the two, is that the Social Security Administration, in most cases, has no idea how many kids you have. In some cases, doesn't know what your income, it depends on the type of work that you do and what your wages are, if they know how much income you have. And they typically write checks to older Americans, which are much less likely, if you're on Social Security over the age of 65, it's very unlikely that you have a child under 18. So they're not really used to dealing with dependents. The IRS, conversely, like their whole thing is that they deal with dependents. And so I think there are just trade-offs here. Both plans would have issued the money monthly. These are intended to be a monthly payment. So I think it really is just about the implementation. I think the Biden administration was right, though, to have this. The plan is supposed to be from July to December of this year. And that, I think, is meaningful because the IRS is in the middle of tax season. We just implemented tax forgiveness for jobless workers, which is probably going to take quite a bit of a lift for them to implement. And they've got to process, millions of returns from Americans. So they said, let's get through tax season. Let's know what everybody made in 2020, and then we'll start writing checks in July. So I think both plans probably have their merits and vary in a couple different ways. There's really not, there's not a child check agency in the federal government. And so we kind of had to work within existing structures, and neither plan proposed creating a new agency to deal with this.
So that will go from July to July. And then the question is whether, I mean, the administration has indicated an interest in extending this.
I think a priority in extending this.
And so is that something that you anticipate seeing maybe in the next, there are 2 more reconciliation opportunities for reconciliation bills until 2022, the election in 2022. Do you anticipate this coming up in the next reconciliation bill?
I think it has to if they don't have Republican support. I think it's unlikely that we would establish this program as permanent. We might re-up it in the next reconciliation package. I think the real goal, though, is to open up, crack open the tax code and make this change permanently. And, there have been conservatives that have expressed interest in it. Mitt Romney is one of them. There are a couple other people who are supportive of the Romney plan and of the idea of, a child allowance type program. There, I think it's really, we're probably going to need 60 votes to make this a permanent reality, given the rules about reconciliation, the cost of the program, et cetera. And so there, I think it's probably more likely that they would try to do it outside of a reconciliation package. Though I would assume, I haven't talked to the Biden administration about this, but I would assume it's certainly not off the table to extend it in these reconciliation packages if they can't do it in other ways. The other thing that's a temporary extension is healthcare subsidies. So a really important part of the bill is that Aca Marketplace Subsidies, most people pay, I think the Kaiser estimates are 10 to 11% of your income is paid on healthcare premiums. And this would cap it at 8.5%, which is quite a large saving for families. So for example, I'm going to read numbers, but we expect for a married couple with 2 children, making kind of lower income, could stand to benefit $4,200 in savings over the next 2 years.
And my understanding is, in addition to capping it at 8.5% of income, regardless of where your income is, that the threshold for subsidies has been raised.
Yes.
Not right? Prior to this bill, it was 400% of poverty. Now, where is that new threshold?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that.
I am so proud that I was able to stump you, Elizabeth, because I'm sitting here.
I would normally Google it real fast, but I didn't know where you were going with this, so I couldn't. No, I don't know the answer. I should leave it at that because I don't want to mess it up.
I know you were capable of not knowing the answer.
I don't focus on healthcare, so it's a little bit outside of my comfort zone, but I had to tabulate this impact. And I do know that for a family making $50,000, they stand to benefit about $4,500 from this over the next 2 years. So that's, huge impact.
My quick question about this child tax credit, though, is outside of Mitt Romney, has there been any Republican support? Because just speaking from a political standpoint, Republicans would likely see value in this child tax credit being taken away in order to hurt the Biden administration going into the midterms. If you're saying that the path forward is via 60 vote threshold.
I think that might be true. I think conversely, if we talk about the party of family ideals and, the pro-life party, I think they're going to really have some answers to give if they cut this back. But, they've done it before. They've scaled other programs back that we could have said that same thing about. So I don't know how it's going to shake out. I think there has, in talks, it seemed like there was, moderate support for a proposal like the Romney plan. I would suspect that, one, clawing this benefit back is pretty hard once it's out there. I suspect we might see some changes in order to get Republicans on board. But I would hope the prospects are good for making this a permanent program.
I am incredibly cynical about the Republicans wanting to do anything, but this is going to be very difficult.
I think the ACA subsidies are certainly a much higher lift than the child tax credit, but both are probably right. The Biden administration is going to have to work really hard to whip those votes.
This was part of the HEROES Act, and I think it's frankly it's garbage from the perspective of a payer. Maybe not so much the payee, but COBRA subsidies. Will do you?
Yes.
Again, this is outside your portfolio, but I mean, you're on COBRA if you get
less outside. Yeah. So it's more in terms of unemployed workers. So COBRA subsidies were increased from 85%. So COBRA premiums are insanely high because it's both the employee contribution and the employer contribution. And so it's, what you see on your paycheck of $200 or $300 a month for your health insurance, or much more in other cases. Your employer typically pays a share of that you don't ever really see that amount. When you're on COBRA, you are responsible for both sides of that, unless your employer is nice enough to kind of kick some money in. And so this bill extends COBRA subsidies and bumps them up from 85% to 100%. And so it's actually, if COBRA was a good program, this would be incredible. But COBRA, it has very low enrollment rates. And most of the workers who are laid off right now came from low wage jobs that probably didn't, many of them didn't offer benefits. A lot of self-employed workers are unemployed right now. And those, you were on your own for insurance as it was anyway. So the potential impact of this program is probably lower, even though on paper, it is really incredible that the government's saying, we'll continue to pay your employer-sponsored healthcare coverage after you are no longer with that employer, when typically these folks are left to kind of fend for themselves, either paying a lot in COBRA subsidies or paying a lot in COBRA premiums, or turning to the Aca Marketplace or Medicaid. I think my preferred program was to be, let them go on Medicare the way that we let disability, folks who claim disability income after a 2-year waiting period are allowed to go on Medicare. And it would have been really cool for the Biden administration to say, let's do Medicare for 20 million Americans who lost their jobs. Like Medicare for most, right?
Exactly.
They
what
don't
it
want to
is.
open that door. They don't want to.
It's a hard door to open. If Bernie Sanders had been elected, I think that would have been the route that we went down. But I'm not sure how House and Senate leadership would have felt about a proposal like that. It wasn't, to my knowledge, even on the table.
Even in the HEROES Act. In the HEROES Act, it was the COBRA subsidies, because they are so desperately afraid. I mean, it's one thing. I mean, the impact that we're talking about with the child tax, refundable child tax credit, the idea that that's going to be a hard thing to claw back from people, because you're going to get used to that after a year or two, and you're going to be like, well, if we could do it then, why can't we do it now? I think they were desperately afraid of giving 20 million Americans, putting them on Medicare and having them go, hey, wait a second.
I think we should have just let, if you are ever eligible for Medicare, you remain eligible for the rest of your life. It's a really great way to make everybody eligible for Medicare. That's not a door I think that anybody was willing to open.
Well, I was, but I'm not.
Same.
Yeah.
But on the COBRA subsidies, to be clear, so I'm paying $400 a month as an employee. My employer is paying maybe $400 a month for my insurance. And so you're saying if I lose my job, then the government picks up the employer part of it, and so I still pay $400, or does it pay the entire $800?
That's a good question. I think it's the whole. I think the idea is that you don't pay anything for COBRA.
Oh, I mean that.
So basically, I think the estimates that we saw, I think the CBO estimate is that it's $122 per week. So really, it's we cut the $300 for the very small amount of people who are going to benefit from this COBRA subsidy. They're actually going to get $400 a week. I think some economists have kind of phrased it that way. I'm not willing to go that far, because I think the enrollment in this is so low. It's also an opt-in program as opposed to an auto-enroll program. So you've got to know it. You and your employer kind of have to know about it. But the nice thing about it is that you don't have to pay it up front and then wait for the government to reimburse you. The money goes straight to your employer so that they can pay the premiums. And so it should all happen in the background once you say, I want to stay on COBRA. The other thing is that the government is going to send you a letter saying you're eligible for this, which, for some people may increase enrollment. A lot of populations are just really hard to reach. And a lot of people don't have, they're not eligible for COBRA, which is the larger problem.
So for those people who were on health insurance and they were employed, for them, for the receiver, it's a great, it's great. But as an efficiency, if Joe Manchin's worried about saving money for the U.S. government, the idea of subsidizing COBRA as opposed to putting people on Medicare is it is a no-brainer.
I mean, conservative, we had conservative support for COBRA subsidies, and it really is mind-boggling to say we are going to spend 4 times the amount that we need to spend to keep people on their employer-based health insurance, which often isn't even as good as Medicare and way more expensive, rather than just saying, we have people who are not retired Americans on Medicare use the same sort of rules to let unemployed workers on Medicare. The problem with putting them on Medicaid, of course, is that not all states expanded Medicaid. So, Medicare is a smarter program to put them on.
But there are incentives in this bill that
every Republican governor said they will not be they're not going to be swayed by the incentives. But yes, there are incentives for states to take up.
I thought there was at least one state that was contemplating it, but
I don't think so. I think a reporter called every state and said that every governor said no.
Goes to the Republican governors for turning down even more
Free money.
They've done this before.
Well, they've done it
They
before.
do it all the time.
That there was like 5% 4 years down the road that you'd have to provide for Medicaid if you were expanding it. I mean, this is literally like
Cutting off your nose to spite the
people,
spite your voters,
people, low income voters.
Right.
So I will say there's two more really important pots of money, and that is nearly $40 billion for the childcare industry, which we know has been decimated by this crisis. And childcare advocates and a lot of women's center think tanks have said this is going to be huge for getting women back into the labor market and for kind of saving the care economy, as they put it. So that is a really good addition. They had been really advocating that back in CARES, which we've never really gotten a lot of childcare assistance. And because they're not K through 12 schooling, they don't benefit from the education aid that's typically in these bills. The other one is that there's about $40 billion for for housing assistance, either through rental assistance, homeowner assistance, or utility assistance. And so $40 billion for both of those is really going to help those folks who are, 1 in 6 renters is behind on rent. I think the average renter is like $5,000 behind in rent payment. So that, even beefs up the rental assistance passed in the December bill. And then finally, the Small Business Administration is creating special grants, $25 billion of grants for restaurants and bars.
And the $86 billion for those pension funds.
There's a union pension
incredibly
bailout. Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating, we have yet to say we're going to allow loans for corporations. I mean, that is that seems to me to be the fundamental difference. Well, in addition to this, we haven't seen payments like these for children. We haven't seen these type of benefits, the full subsidies on COBRA. It's not the way that we should be doing it. And it is such a defensive mechanism to provide, to prevent people from sort of appreciating the value of Medicare, of expanding Medicare. Nevertheless, what strikes me about this is that there's not only not a hint of austerity in this bill, there's also not a hint of we had to pay off corporate America to allow to give direct assistance to people.
That's fair. Yeah. So let's compare it to a couple other bills. So for example, the CARES Act was $2.2 trillion, but really $500 billion was for those Fed lending facilities, which Mnuchin then clawed back at the end of the year. So let's say 1.7. So this tops CARES. This is now the 4th coronavirus response bill. We had Families First, CARES, the $900 billion in December, and now 1.9 trillion. So this is the biggest package yet. But even outside of this crisis, if we look back to the Great Recession, there was one big package, the American Recovery Act, ARA, and that was $830 billion. And, every bill other than Families First has topped that. And that was the one, they got one shot and they said, we can't cross the trillion mark. We'll never be able to spend $1 trillion. They never went back to the pot other than, small little things tacked on to other bills here and there in the aftermath. And so if we look at, when President Biden was running at the time, Vice President was running that response, this is a total 180 in terms of how much we can spend, who the benefits are for. So if we compare to the Trump tax cuts, the TCJA, the average benefit for households earning less than $25,000 was $60. And this bill is $2,800 for the same households and $7,700 if those households have children. You are getting $8,000 if you make less than $25,000 and have children. And the bottom 20% of income earners will have a 20% boost in income. This is true. They said our priority in this bill is not high income earners. It's not, we got a lot of state and local money, but it wasn't lending facilities. It was direct assistance to low income families and, cutting child poverty in half, making sure SNAP benefits are boosted, people have health care, all that stuff. It's like a totally different mindset than what we saw in the aftermath of the Great Recession, but also, at any point during the Trump administration.
And I just want to add that stimulus package in the wake of the 2008 crisis, half of it was tax cuts. So you didn't have this type of direct payments to people at all.
We got $400 billion in direct payments on those stimulus checks. and about $300 billion in jobless aid. And then you've got, the child tax credit. So like even before we get there, we've passed what ARA had for households.
We're running out of time. I'll also say that the HAMP program that was supposed to help with foreclosures was a complete bust and a disaster. And so that money was irrelevant, really, I think, to helping people. Elizabeth Pancotti, I could talk to you more about what's going on with state and local, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So much.
Quick break. We'll be right back to wrap things up.